In this video, I'm going to discuss some of the reasons, in my opinion, why people still believe that Lucy Letby is guilty. Now, obviously, this week has been a trying one for those of us that don't believe this, with these further potential charges being levelled against Lucy. Um, I'm going to discuss that in my video on Sunday, and there will be some content on that in this video. I wanted to begin by discussing fundamentally why people still believe Lucy to be guilty. I think the first group of people, I believe essentially there are five groups of people that believe this. The first group of people can be dealt with quite simply. It's just people who don't know enough about the case to form a coherent opinion. That's what it's the primary, if not the sole reason that I've written a book, is to get something into the mainstream that is authoritative, hopefully, and informative. Most people's impression of any subject really comes from media headlines, and this very much feeds into the recent decisions of the police to firstly arrest these executives that they haven't even named. Of course, when they first arrested Lucy, they named her immediately. So one would have to ask why they've done that, and one would have to ask why they haven't named these people, whereas previously they have named people. It's not particularly clear why there is this disparity in the way that they've dealt with this. Of course, these are completely frivolous arrests. I know for a fact that the executives are 100% innocent and can't possibly be charged, and the case can never conceivably go to court. I can't talk about all the background of that at the moment for numerous reasons, but of course it's all in the Thirlwell documents, and there's a lot of stuff about that hasn't been revealed yet. So it's very critical for the police to control the narrative, to use a term that lawyers have used, because that is what informs the average person's view and perspective. It also, I'm going to talk about a lot of cognitive biases in this video. And the first one I'm going to introduce to you is referred to as the illusory truth effect. This is the tendency to believe false information to be correct after repeated exposure. I should say that I forgot to mention this at the start of the video, but I've decided to give people something nice to look at today. I will be putting some information on the screen later on, particularly with regards to cognitive biases, but there is a reason as well for putting this stuff in the background that I will explain towards the end of the video. But if you're watching the video, it's not. I just wanted to give people something pleasant to look at. It's been a miserable week, and it hasn't been a great week for me personally, aside from stuff that's happened to Lucy. But I mean, I'm absolutely fine. Just some stuff has happened, and it doesn't really affect me directly, but it affects a close friend. So it's not been the best week. So I just thought, instead of looking at me, which surely wouldn't cheer anyone up, or looking at documents and the stuff I usually put on the screen, I thought to look at something aesthetically pleasing would be a good thing. And I'll expand on that later in the video. So the illusory truth effect, as I mentioned, it's just the idea that if you're fed false information and it's repeated over and over again, people start to believe it, even if they know that it's untrue. Now, that's a very interesting phenomenon in itself, but of course, in the age of media, that's hugely significant, because people do have false things and do have inaccurate things and do even have perspectives that they may at one time disagree with, repeat them over and over again, and then they start to accept them. There's quite a famous quote by George W. Bush in which he says, "In my line of work, you got to keep repeating things over and over again for the truth to sink in, to kind of catapult the propaganda." And he's just simply, I think, not regarded as a great orator, not regarded as a very intelligent man, but he knew enough to know that you just repeat things over and over and over again, and then eventually people accept them. So I think the arrest of the executive this week is particularly despicable because they're 100% innocent. Of course, we believe that Lucy's innocent, and I'm as close as you can be to 100% certain of that, given that I wasn't on the uni at the time. So I can only ever, I think, be 99.9% innocent, just as certain of her innocence, just as no one can ever be 100% certain of her guilt. But I think to weaponize arrests in this way and use them strategically and tactically as if they're moves in a game of chess, in an ongoing war, like a PR war that now exists, essentially, between those of us that know this is an unsafe conviction and the people that are responsible for it, who now want to pretend that it's okay. Like Peter Hitchens has been writing about this today. It's just awful to use to, because being arrested, it's never happened to me, but I should imagine it's a fairly alarming and traumatic experience. And now that I know that you're not guaranteed a fair trial and so forth, and now I know that what the police are capable of doing, I think just to randomly arrest people who absolutely, clearly, categorically are not guilty of any offence, like we know this 100%, it's just unbelievable. But at the same time, as well as being unbelievable, it's also not even surprising. I don't know what that says about our institutions and about the police and about our society, but clearly it's not a good thing. So that's the first group. The second group are people who don't believe what they're actually saying, but they're doing it for some sort of promotional reason. There's no point in investing any time in these people, just as no one should react to them or pay any attention to them. They're just people without any moral fibre or integrity whatsoever. The third group, and the three groups remaining are the ones that I want to discuss primarily in this video. And the third group, in a way, I think, is possibly the most prominent among people that comment online. And that is people who are emotionally invested in the outcome of this case. And I think that primarily comes from the fact that there are babies involved. The fact there are babies involved, naturally, that is immediately emotionally traumatic for people. And once they experience that, and once they come to the conclusion that Lucy Letby is guilty, that creates an emotional bond with that conclusion in their minds. And the fact that someone has been blamed for it is like a form of closure. It's an interesting phenomenon for me, the idea of psychological closure. So again, I like to cite sporting examples because I used to follow a lot of sport. I've been doing it a lot less because of what I've been doing with Lucy's case and just a general decline in my interest, but I still follow it quite closely. And I remember when Andy Murray was playing his final Wimbledon, so he got to the end of his career, he was knackered, he had a metal hip, he was losing all the time, he couldn't play anymore, but he still wanted to play Wimbledon. And ultimately, this was a completely pointless exercise because he wasn't very good anymore. He was on his last legs, and he managed to get himself just about fit enough to play Wimbledon. I think he didn't play the singles, and of course he lost in the first round the doubles, and he couldn't play the mixed doubles because Raducanu was playing the singles and she pulled out, and that was it. That served no logical or rational purpose whatsoever from such a great player who's been deep in Wimbledon so many times and in Grand Slams, won the Olympics, won the Davis Cup, all these things. But it's a psychological aspect of human beings that we don't really understand, that we like to close things off. We don't like a story to be left open if it's one that's important to us. So we like to have this concept of closure in our lives. And I think people that hear about the Letby case and hear about the deaths of infants, there's like a traumatic impact on them. So when that's closed off and Lucy Letby is blamed for them, that's in a way kind of resolves the trauma for them. So they don't want that to be reopened because closure is so important for us. I think that's particularly true for females who obviously have a very natural reason to be biologically connected to infants, not diminishing the contribution of male parents, which is very important, but you don't need to be a genius to see the anatomical reasons why females have a really strong bond with children and with young children in particular. So I think some of the people that are most determined online to express the idea that Lucy Letby is guilty when this concept is clearly falling apart evidentially, medically, in every conceivable way, I think the identity of several of those people is quite clearly female, and I think it is for the reasons that I've just mentioned. And I think they ultimately forget why they're even invested in this in the first place. It just becomes a very strange cognitive bias in their brains. One thing you have to remember, and it's easy to forget this, and probably a lot of people watching this video, or a certain number, will never have considered this, but a lot of people who are walking around out there, they don't have the slightest clue why they do anything that they do. They really don't. They're not. They're very much detached from their conscious minds, and that's really that results from living in this society that is so media connected. So we are so connected to the media. We live our lives through a bubble of media all the time. Um, I like. There's a joke in The Simpsons where the sideshow Bob is one of the episodes where he's decrying television and then he says, "Look," he says, "I understand the irony of communicating this through television, so don't bother pointing that out to me. So I understand that I'm communicating this to you through media, so I understand the irony of that." But we do live in this media bubble. Most people's reality, to a greater or lesser extent, is at the very least strongly influenced by what they see in the media. And then, of course, you have advertising hammering you over the head constantly as well. Those are just two factors immediately that are massive. There are lots of others as well. Social pressure, there's peer pressure, all kinds of things. But the kind of resultant effect of that is that people's decision making is very much influenced by unconscious factors that they just don't realise that they're influenced by. And there've been studies and so on to demonstrate the differences in a society that doesn't have television and that doesn't have mass media compared to one that does, and how different the people are, and how different their perception is and their perspective is, and so forth. So when you encounter people saying, "Oh, Lucy's guilty, Lucy's the worst person in the world," all the kind of crap they come out with, you've got to understand a lot of these people don't have any self-awareness. They don't have the slightest idea why they believe things or why they do things. I know that sounds very dismissive, but it's absolutely true. So I'm going to be talking about cognitive biases in this video. And what I want to introduce to you before I do that is a simple concept that we all experience. So we all have the experience of believing that we are rational human beings and that all of our choices are rational. There are all kinds of systems in our body that create this illusion within us, but of course it's not true at all. There are all manner of cognitive biases that we all experience all the time, and even the most objective and intellectual and rational among us are absolutely subjected to these biases. And even if we know about the biases, we can still be vulnerable to them, let alone if we don't know about them. So it's very even the greatest thinker can get things completely wrong due to innate cognitive biases, let alone like someone of average ability, for example. So one cognitive bias that I often encounter, to give another sporting example, is recency bias. So I often see this in football and in cricket when you see people talking about stuff. So just the other day, I watched a video about cricket, about the England-India Test series that's taking place now. And I saw someone who's a very experienced gentleman, Michael Vaughan, who used to be England captain. And he was going on about how England are great and how this team are great and they'll just find a way to win, and India on the ropes now and all this and that and the other. And I could see immediately this is an obvious example of recency bias. Just because England won the first match in the series, he's now overlooking all of the aspects of that match that could have gone very wrong for them. And I thought, and he was almost writing India off in this series. And I was thinking, well, India is still a very good team with very good players. I wouldn't be quite so certain that England are going to win this series easily. And of course, as I'm speaking now, India are batting against England and they're in a very strong position. I think they've got 500 now. I'm not following it that closely because I'm recording this, but that's an example of recency bias. Just the idea that recent events take on an importance that is then felt cited or felt disproportionately by that person, and then you forget about everything else that you know previously, or you diminish those things. And you'll see this all the time in the assessment of many things. So that's just an example of one cognitive bias. Another very famous one is the gambler's fallacy, sometimes referred to as the Monte Carlo fallacy, and that refers to that it's usually illustrated by talking about the tossing of a coin. So if you toss a coin in the air and it comes down heads, a certain number of people will tend to believe that that reduces the chances that it'll be a head the second time. But of course, that's not true. They're completely independent events. It doesn't make the slightest difference. If you toss the coin again, it's still 50-50. If you get heads again, and you toss it a third time, it's still 50-50. And this term, the Monte Carlo fallacy, originates from an occurrence in Monte Carlo, as the name would suggest, in 1913, where there was a casino, and black came up 26 times in succession on the wheel. That must be millions. It could be even billions to one to happen. I'd have to calculate that. But yeah, it can happen. It can happen because every time you start again, it's just you think something happening 26 times in a row. You're multiplying all the odds, but really it's just 50%, 50%, 50%, 50%. It won't happen very often that something comes up 26 times in a row, but it can. And that's another example of cognitive bias. But there are many other. So let me give you another example of recency bias. So if you're doing something, it's something that you know you can do well, and you make a mistake or you get something wrong, then your confidence can drain away very quickly, and you suddenly forget about how you've been trained to do this, and all the things that you've been good at. Again, there's something that happens in sport quite a lot, where suddenly you'll see someone's confidence drain away, and sometimes they actually never recover their form and their proficiency, because they overestimate the importance of recent events, and that's fresh in their memory and forefront in their thinking, and then all the times they played really well just drain away. So there are many other cognitive biases, and I'm now going to discuss some of them that are particularly relevant to the case of Lucy Letby and to why people have made mistakes and continue to make mistakes and continue to have a strange perception of this horrendous situation. So there are many cognitive biases that relate to the Lucy Letby case, and I'm going to begin with conservatism or conservatism bias, a bias which refers to the tendency to revise one's belief insufficiently when presented with new evidence. This bias describes human belief revision, in which people overweigh the prior distribution and underweigh new sample evidence when compared to Bayesian belief revision. That's a bit more technical. The first sentence is quite clear. It's like once we establish a belief, I think for anyone, once that's quite a cemented and concretized belief within us, it can be very difficult to shift that belief, and we will tend to ignore new evidence when it arises. So the problem in this case is that there was an enormous amount of ammunition fired at the general population, and then for them to revise that opinion then takes an enormous amount of effort. Of course, we've done a pretty good job of that so far, but that's just one cognitive bias. Second one here is the clustering illusion. The clustering illusion is the tendency to erroneously consider the inevitable streaks or clusters arriving in small samples from random distributions to be non-random. The illusion is caused by a human tendency to underpredict the amount of variability likely to appear in a small sample of random or pseudo-random data. So this doesn't really require any further explanation. This is relating to the statistics in the case that have been based exactly on this type of clustering. Another form of cognitive bias is illusory correlation. This is the phenomenon of perceiving a relationship between variables, typically people, events, or behaviours, even when no such relationship exists. A false association may be formed because rare or novel occurrences are more salient and therefore tend to capture one's attention. So this goes right back to when Stephen Berry began to finger Lucy on the unit, where there was this illusory correlation, and which has since been cited fundamentally in this court case. These are both examples of something that's more broadly referred to as apophenia. This is a tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things, which is exactly what has occurred in the Lucy Letby case. Well, without dwelling on this too much, we'll now go on to the next cognitive bias, which is attentional bias. Attentional bias refers to how a person's perception is affected by selective factors in their attention. Attentional biases may explain an individual's failure to consider alternative possibilities when occupied with an existing train of thought. So again, we see here that once our attention is trained on a certain thing or certain conclusion, we can then start walling off other possibilities, even though those actual so-called alternative possibilities might in fact be more compelling and indeed correct. That should need no further explanation. Frequency illusion. The frequency illusion, also known as Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, I wonder why it's referred to as Bader-Meinhof, because they were quite a notable German militant group that used to bomb places and stuff. And we'll come back to that in a second. The frequency illusion is a cognitive bias in which a person notices a specific concept, word, or product more frequently after recently becoming aware of it. So this is similar to recency bias in a way, but when you're encountering something in this Lucy Letby case for the first time, then you're repeatedly told, Lucy Letby's done this, Lucy Letby's done that. Suddenly, you're noticing it wherever you look, and again, you start to push away the evidence that doesn't fit with that impression. The name Bader-Meinhof phenomenon was coined in 1994 by Terry Mullen in a letter to St. Paul Pioneer Press. The letter describes how after mentioning the name of the German militant group, Bader-Meinhof once, he kept noticing it. Okay, there we go. So, quite an interesting history into Bader-Meinhof, but I won't go into that in this video. Salience bias, also referred to as perceptual salience, is a cognitive bias that predisposes individuals to focus on or attend to items, information, or stimuli that are more prominent, visible, or emotionally striking. This is as opposed to stimuli that are unremarkable or less salient, even though this difference is often irrelevant by objective standards. So this applies to this case in so many different ways. One good example of salient bias or salience bias that you will see in the media, a great example of this is when students get their exam results, and they will pretty much, always without exception in the press, use images of pretty girls in relation to these, because it would just simply, of course, that happens in the media a lot. We often have good-looking people being presented to us to make us pay attention. But you'll see that almost inevitably, if you look at any coverage of exam results, it's girls, and it's usually pretty girls. And it's just simply it's all of these things, prominent, visible, emotionally striking. So, but that's not the only example of it in the Lucy Letby case. Obviously, what has occurred with the consultants is that they've focused on the presence of Lucy Letby very rapidly. And that has predisposed them to focus on this visible and prominent form of information when they should know very well, they would be considered intelligent people, they should know that there can be other things going on under the surface that are less prominent that can explain all these collapses, which of course we now know were indeed very significant. The next form of bias is selection bias. This is the bias introduced by the selection of individuals, groups, or data for analysis in such a way that proper randomization is not achieved, thereby failing to ensure that the sample obtained is representative of the population intended to be analysed. It is sometimes referred to as the selection effect. So this is very important, as mentioned here, in the distortion of statistical analysis resulting from the method of collecting samples. Again, people that are familiar with this case do not need to have this explained to them. The selection of cases for this court case, for the so-called work of Dowie Evans, was highly biased, whether deliberately or subconsciously. I would say it was deliberate to some extent. But certainly the way that things were selected was inherently biased, as we well know by now. The next thing is the bias blind spot. The bias blind spot is the cognitive bias of recognizing the impact of biases on the judgment of others while failing to see the impact of biases on one's own judgment. The term was created by Emily Pronin, a social psychologist from Princeton University's Department of Psychology, with colleagues Daniel Lin and Lee Ross. The bias blind spot is named after visual blind spot. Most people appear to exhibit the bias blind spot. In a sample of more than 600 residents of the United States, more than 85% believed they were less biased than the average American. Only one participant believed that they were more biased than the average American. So, yeah, I would be guilty of that myself. I believe I'm more objective than the average person. Now, I might be correct in that, but of course, that's an inherent bias that I have towards myself. I could be completely wrong. I might not be any more objective than the average person. Who knows? But that, again, very much relates to the consultant. It very much relates to Dowie Evans. It very much relates to people that oversee this case. We ourselves, as people who believe Lucy Letby to be likely innocent or completely innocent, we have to be careful of this as well. We have to be careful that we're not being biased, and we have to assess the evidence as carefully as we can. I must say that throughout this process, I've always been looking for the convincing or compelling evidence, and particularly the smoking gun that points to Lucy's guilt. So that was a way that I tried to guard against this consciously. And of course, I never saw that smoking gun. But this is just yet another example of cognitive bias. It appears that almost everyone is vulnerable to this. So next one is illusion of transparency. The illusion of transparency is a tendency for people to overestimate the degree to which their personal mental state is known by others. Another manifestation of the illusion of transparency, sometimes called the observer's illusion of transparency, is a tendency for people to overestimate how well they understand others' personal mental states. Let me reread that. It's a tendency for people to overestimate how well they understand others' personal mental states. Now, I'm not addressing that anyone in particular, Judith Moritz, but that could be something that could be levelled at certain people who have commented on this court case and on the demeanour of Lucy Letby. Illusion of validity. The illusion of validity is a cognitive bias in which a person overestimates their ability to interpret and predict accurately the outcome when analysing a set of data, in particular when the data analysed show a very consistent pattern, that is when the data tells a coherent story. This effect persists even when the person is aware of all the factors that limit the accuracy of their predictors, that is when the data and or methods used to judge them lead to highly fallible predictions. So this is once again related to the statistical case, the way that data has been interpreted in this court case. It's another massive cognitive bias that's a big problem in the investigation. And you can be absolutely certain that Dr. Dowie Evans has never considered this for a second. And you can be crystal clear with crystal clear certainty that the Cheshire Constabulary will never consider this. They don't appear capable of any sort of coherent reasoning, you might describe it as. Overconfidence effect. The overconfidence effect is a well-established bias in which a person's subjective confidence in their judgments is reliably greater than the objective accuracy of those judgments, especially when confidence is relatively high. So again, we've seen Dr. Evans say, I'm absolutely certain that Lucy Letby is guilty, even though there's this very shaky circumstantial case, like no one has seen her do anything. There is no concrete evidence. It doesn't really make sense. The acts, the crimes don't really make sense. Psychologically, there's no indication of anyone that's committed a crime. There are no red flags for someone who would be expected to commit such acts, and secondly, who had committed such acts and would experience the usual psychological degradation that would be associated with that. Usually you see very strange behaviour from people that are serial killers and that have killed people en masse over a period of time, picking them off one by one. Usually there is a very clear emotional and psychological decline in these people, whereas with Lucy there's just no evidence of that. So all of these things together would point to there should be significant doubt, and yet due to Dowie Evans' incredible arrogance, in my estimation, he's emblematic of this overconfidence effect where he just believes everything he says is correct, even though his ability is relatively modest, in my opinion. Egocentric bias. So this is very, very relevant to the previous one and to everything I just mentioned. Egocentric bias is the tendency to rely too heavily on one's own perspective and or have a high opinion of oneself than reality. It appears to be the result of the psychological need to satisfy one's ego and to be advantageous for memory consolidation. Research has shown that experiences, ideas, and beliefs are more easily recalled when they match one's own, causing an egocentric outlook. So this needs no further analysis, no further comment, I believe. Compassion fade is the tendency to experience a decrease in empathy as the number of people in need of aid increase. As a type of cognitive bias, it has a significant effect on the pro-social behaviour from which helping behaviour generates. So this isn't massively related to the Lucy Letby case, but I wanted to highlight this because what this really means essentially is that it's very difficult to have empathy with a million people. We just can't process that. So we will tend to have more empathy when it's small numbers of people. Of course, when we hear about horrific events like the bombing of Hiroshima, for example, that's horrifying because it's an atomic bomb attack and we understand the consequence of that. So it's horrifying. But in a way, it has more impact on us when we see the individual cases from Hiroshima rather than the overall attack. And this is encapsulated by this famous quote that maybe have been made by Stalin. I'm not sure if it was or not. There's some doubt about it, and there's a suggestion it may have been initially stated by Kurt Tucholsky. But it's one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. And that is kind of emblematic of this idea that we can't really compute a million deaths, but when there's one small incident, relatively small. Today, the Liverpool footballer Diego Jota has died in a car crash with his brother. There's been an outpouring of grief. And we can understand that, and then we can empathise, and then we can feel the human loss. Whereas a million deaths is just incalculable. So there's still a few examples of cognitive bias that I'd like to look at. Beginning with sampling bias, a bias in which a sample is collected in such a way that some members of the intended population have a lower or higher sampling probability than others. Now, this was so strongly represented by what has occurred in this court case and the chart that's been presented in court and the so-called statistical analysis that's been done. It's untrue how much there has been a sampling bias in this court case and in the highly regrettable conviction of Lucy Letby. And this is another, I want to finish with several aspects of cognitive bias that are really central to this case. So another one is gender bias. So this is talking about the tendency to prefer one gender over another. But it's not, I think, only that. It's also that we have different expectations of men and women. And I think we tend to be more judgmental of women. I believe societally that is the case. And certainly when it comes to children, I think that is undeniably the case. That there are expectations on the way that women should behave emotionally in relation to children that are onerous and completely unreasonable. And I would say as well that I just cannot imagine that some of the things that have been said about Lucy Letby, I mean, I highlighted an Independent article where I think despicable things were said about her. But I think the general level of judgmental commentary with regards to her appearance, with regards to her behaviour, with regards to her demeanour, etc., I just cannot imagine that would happen with regard to a man. Like I can't, for example, the guy who killed Sarah Everard, Wayne Couzens, isn't it? I don't recall anyone talking about his beard or the fact that he's going bald or, you know, he's a bit overweight or, you know, his choice of clothes or anything like that. It's just he's committed these horrendous acts. He's a monster. Or, you know, understandably, he was strongly criticised for what was appalling and abysmal behaviour. But I don't recall anyone saying, well, he should be responding like this emotionally, or he should be doing this emotionally, or, you know, why is he wearing these drab clothes, or why is he got a bit of a pot belly, or, you know, none of this was mentioned. I haven't seen anyone talk about his appearance at all, or anything to do with his character, personality, emotional presentation, or anything like that. And I think this is, at best, quite sexist and probably ultimately misogynistic. And I think we do have these inbuilt biases still, even though they've improved significantly from when I was younger. But I still think they exist, and I still think that they have been very prominent in this case. Another common, a very common cognitive bias is described as naive realism. This is the human tendency to believe that we see the world around us objectively and that people who disagree with us must be uninformed, irrational, or biased. Now, of course, again, we need to be careful of this ourselves. This is another, this can be a manifestation of in-group and out-group psychology, but this can also explain why you see these very strong reactions from people that still wish to believe that Lucy Letby is guilty, because they associate themselves with the idea that their own beliefs are objective and that the opposing view simply is not objective, and that the other side, quote unquote side, is uninformed, irrational, or biased, as stated here, when in reality, and I mean, I think I can say quite confidently that we're on the right side of this, not just because we've looked at the evidence, but also look at the caliber of people that have come out in favour of the idea this is a miscarriage of justice, and look at the caliber of people who defend the idea that it's a safe conviction, and compare the caliber and number of those two people, and you'll very quickly see the disparity. And then secondly, think of all the evidence that's come out over and over and over again, relentlessly, for months and months and months, that points to innocence, that points to this being an unsafe conviction. And then think about how little, i.e. nothing, and you could argue nothing at all until these 12 cases. This is the first thing that people who believe that Lucy Letby is guilty can cling to and say, oh, look, she might have been guilty of some other cases. There's nothing that has come forward at all to buttress the original conviction. Nothing. Nothing and no one. No serious or credible person has looked at this case and said, you know what, I think she's guilty. Not one. There isn't a single one. Everyone that's done it either is not serious and not credible, or has a vested interest related to the legal system. Usually, we've had a few lawyers say, "Oh, it's a safe conviction," but usually they haven't looked at the case and haven't familiarised themselves with the details. And of course, they've got a very self-serving reason to believe in Lucy's guilt. They don't want to bite the hand that feeds them, essentially, and they have this inbuilt bias towards the legal system being correct. So that if you just simply look at the people that have come out and what's come out since the court case, that would very strongly indicate that we're correct. But despite that, despite the enormous amount of evidence that's come out, despite the caliber of people that have come forward in support of this, some people that continue to believe that she's guilty, despite the fact that they are not those that are superficially have a superficial impression of the case where they haven't examined it properly. They're immersed in it and thinking about it every day and involved in it all the time, yet they still believe themselves to be correct, despite everything that's come out that should have annihilated their belief system, or at the very least resulted in them questioning what they believe, and yet it hasn't. And this is one of the reasons for that. This naive realism that I form my belief, I'm objective, people who disagree with me simply must be uninformed, irrational, or biased. Even when this becomes untenable, it's untenable to say the panel is uninformed. It's untenable to say these people coming forward are uninformed, let alone irrational or biased. They don't have any reason to be biased because they're just seeing the information for the first time. They don't benefit from it one way or another. In fact, it'd be easier for them to keep quiet in some cases. But this is a very important cognitive bias that is central to this entire issue. Another one, this is cited so much it's almost become a cliche, but like the Dunning-Kruger effect of people with limited competence overestimating their abilities. Now, this applies to so many people involved in this issue that still have an opinion on this issue, that are commenting on this issue every day. Of course, it very strongly applies to Dr. Evans as well. I'm not even going to explain this because everyone knows what the Dunning-Kruger effect is now, and it's really obvious how this is a significant cognitive bias in the Lucy Letby case. Finally, I want to discuss system justification theory. So this is a theory within social psychology that system-justifying beliefs serve a psychologically palliative function. It proposes that people have several underlying needs, which vary from individual to individual, that can be satisfied by the defence and justification of the status quo, even when the system may be disadvantageous to certain people. People have epistemic, existential, and relational needs that are met by and manifest as ideological support for the prevailing structure of social, economic, and political norms. Need for order and stability, and thus resistance to change or alternatives, for example, can be a motivator for individuals to see the status quo as good, legitimate, and even desirable. So, with regard to this, people have an inherent need, generally, broadly speaking, even if they're critical of the system, to use a slightly hackneyed phrase, and the authorities to some extent, or even to a great extent, but they still have an inherent need to believe that things are ultimately functioning in a way that is in their interests, or at least will result in stability, and that the authorities can be trusted, for want of a better term. And the reason for this is quite simply, we know that our chances of having any direct influence on the authorities is very slim. I mean, essentially, we're told you can vote once every 5 years, and that's it. And what other opportunity would you really have to have any influence? That there are ways you can do grassroots activism and so forth, but I think everyone is aware that there are forces in this world that we cannot influence, and that they have power over us, and that they overarch us. So there's a very obvious need for people to believe that those forces are benign or even beneficial to us, I suppose. I guess not that many people believe that today, but there still has to be a thought of, oh, well, everything will be okay, everything is fine the way that it is. As soon as you start questioning fundamentally the well-being of these social systems, it causes, again, this causes trauma in people, because they have to question the belief system they've been inculcated with since birth. I discussed this earlier in the video, how a perspective on life is being hammered into our brains constantly by the media. So you're talking about decades of conditioning and decades of social example, and all of these people's peers may believe this, or their family may believe this, or their friends may believe this, the television's telling them this, etc., etc. So it can be very hard to break out that conditioning, even though most people know, the vast majority of people know that are very fundamental problems with important aspects of society and institutions, and that, not that it's all malignant either, but to just blindly trust the status quo clearly makes no sense. Just yesterday, or a couple of days ago on Reddit, I said to someone, how long have you lived in Britain? The reason I'm asking you this is because I encounter people every day who still, despite everything, have the attitude that the authorities know best and can be trusted, and will even put the institutions of this country on a pedestal. And to say that I find this staggering would be an understatement. But it's because of the cognitive bias that I've just mentioned. So when you put all of these biases together collectively, and then with the other things that I've mentioned previously, this helps to explain why people will perceive this issue in completely the wrong way. And these are all some of these lead to errors of reasoning. Some of them lead to kind of emotional states that influence the way people perceive this issue. There are many other things that I could go into as well. For example, the average attention span is now very poor. I've sat on a train seeing people flick through video. They flick through them. You've got 2 seconds. Like a video is presented. Right, you've got 2 seconds to be interesting. That's not interesting. 2 seconds. Oh, that's okay. I'll watch that for 5 seconds. Oh, it's not interesting. And I just see that that's younger people typically just flicking. But the attention span has been destroyed by our modern culture, and mine has been damaged. It's fortunate that I grew up without the internet, so my attention span is still reasonably good, but it's not as good as it used to be. That's because of the internet. It's because of the contemporary culture, undoubtedly. So that's just another issue. And then even if we're aware of all these things I've discussed in the video, it's still very difficult for us to overcome our inherent biases, because our brains are not perfect. Our brains can do extraordinary things, but they're essentially very, very fast calculators, and they're tied in with our nervous system and certain other preservative functions which are designed to protect us. So not all of our reasoning and not all of our thinking is correct, and that's even if we're aware of these things, which we're often not. I think when I reflect on all of these things, it makes me really glad that I'm a writer and I don't have any desire to be a talking head, because what I will do and what I hope to continue to do going forward is just immerse myself in one subject so that I know it inside out, and then obviously write on that subject, and then I'm happy to speak on it as well. I don't really want to have a platform where I'm saying, okay, today I'm going to talk about the Israel-Iran conflict, and then the day after that I'm going to talk about the benefits bill, and then the day after that I'm going to talk about assisted dying, whether or not it's a good thing. Then the day after that I'm going to talk about whether mayonnaise or tomato ketchup is the best condiment. And then the day after that I'm going to talk about whether dogs are better than cats. Then the day after that I'm going to go back to the Israel crisis. You know, I don't want to do that because obviously I have an opinion on lots of things, but I'd rather, if I'm going to sit and comment on something, I'd rather know that I know that topic inside out and that I'm not vulnerable to these cognitive biases. It's always kind of fascinating to me when you see these people who are so confident in their opinion on seemingly any topic. That seems to be a very modern, it seems to be a really strong phenomenon on the internet where you get kind of guru-ish type people who just, that you never ask them a question, they say, I've got no idea. I don't have an opinion on that. I don't know anything about it. They have an opinion on anything and everything seemingly. And I want to be like that. I just want to drill into a subject so deeply that I'm certain that I know about it, and then talk about that, and then I'll move on to the next subject. So obviously, I'm very passionate about Lucy's case, and that's my focus at the moment. And then hopefully, I mean, I definitely think I'll be doing stuff in the miscarriage of justice field for the rest of my life. I'd like to tackle some other subjects as well, but it very much more appeals to me to forensically examine something rather than just say, well, I reckon this is the case. Um, and when you look at all the cognitive biases that exist, and that's before you even talk about how much information you need to know about a topic to understand it. It's quite, I feel very comfortable being where I am, and I would not want to be someone who's there commenting more broadly on various issues. So there are two big discriminatory factors in the Lucy Letby case. The first one of these is emotion. That's one of the reasons that people feel so strongly about something like this. We're preconditioned to want to protect children. That instinct is inbuilt for quite obvious reasons. So in the case of Lucy Letby, this leads to what can be described as a conditioned emotional response. This is related to classical conditioning in psychology, whereby people associate Lucy Letby with these horrible and traumatic acts, and the two become intertwined, sometimes referred to as Pavlovian conditioning, in relation to Pavlov, who was a psychologist who did a very famous experiment with dogs where he rang a bell at the same time as he gave dogs food, and then after a while he took away the food but kept ringing the bell, and the dogs would salivate expecting food, even though the two things are completely unrelated. So that's a very simple example. Humans are not quite as easily Pavlovian subjected to Pavlovian conditioning as dogs, but it's not far off. It's not as far off as you think. So all of these things of seeing Lucy Letby's picture, it's like you can very quickly in your brain associate that picture with evil. If you've decided she murdered the babies and you have a traumatized response, etc., that can become very cemented. You'd be surprised how strong that effect is, and it's why imagery is often used when trying to convince someone of something or condition them. And then, as I've mentioned as well, this leads into another. This all the numerous, I would say, not all of them, but numerous cognitive biases that I've discussed here lead into this concept of subjective validation. This is a cognitive bias in which people would consider a statement or a piece of information to be correct if it has personal meaning or significance to them. So, because of the conditioned emotional response that I've just mentioned, people then start to think, right, Lucy Letby is guilty of this, and then it's very difficult to break that cognitive bias that they've had. And then, as I mentioned, there's this societal need to believe that the authorities are competent. And there have been many psychological experiments that point to this, such as Milgram's obedience studies from the 1960s, which demonstrated that individuals will follow authoritative commands, even harmful ones, due to a perceived legitimacy of a figure. Research that followed this up described this as engaged followership, that participants will obey when they identify with the purpose of the authority, suggesting that trust arises from shared values, not compliance. So in this case, people identify that the authorities are attempting to prevent baby murders, and they're attempting to punish someone for what are perceived to be baby murders, and so that can achieve compliance with the purpose of the authorities, even though the authorities may not be competent, and as we know, they are not competent. Another example was Ash's conformity experiments from the 1950s, which indicated that individuals aligned behaviours and judgments with a unanimous group majority to fit in or assume group correctness, even when obviously wrong. Social conditioning here involves internalisation of group norms and the psychological rewards of fitting in, establishing a basis for trusting group-endorsed authority. Now, I'm sure everyone has experienced that, and it does take a strong person to go against the group majority. That has been one of my great strengths in life. I guess one of my great weaknesses is fitting into a group and feeling a sense of belonging within a group. But that's just me personally. Most people want to fit in, want to be part of a group, and they will go to quite significant lengths to do this, even endorsing beliefs that make absolutely no sense. So in this particular case, at one time, the idea that Lucy Letby was guilty was the unanimous majority view, even though there were already many people questioning it before the verdict, and certainly from the day of the verdict, that's when I began to question it. So what we need to do is reach a critical mass where it's the normalised view that this is a probable miscarriage of justice. Then there'll still be these people, for all the reasons that I've mentioned, that will still believe that she's guilty. There will be people that believe Lucy's guilty after she's released. There's nothing you can do about that. We just need to reach the critical mass point. But this kind of this notion of social conformity in belief is another significant factor. And then there are other things, authority bias and social influence, our tendency to overvalue claims from perceived authority figures, seen as a heuristic rooted in early conditioning to respect hierarchy that I've already mentioned. This was documented by Kelman's social influence theory, published in 1953, which identified compliance to external pressure, identification of aligning with valued authority, and internalization, long-term belief change, each reflecting social conditioning pathways. So this is an established theory. It's not some conspiracy thing that I've come up with off the top of my head. This is known to be the case. It's been known to be the case for many decades. This is used, whether consciously or subconsciously or unknowingly, by people in positions of positional authority all the time. Then there's institutional and procedural trust. Socialization theories argue trust in institutions is formed early through family, schools, and media and remains stable into adulthood. Very recent research on this from Tamalina, presumably two relatives, who frame institution-based trust via context, cognition, social orientation, and knowledge. Perceptions of fairness and legitimacy are shaped by early conditioning and become pivotal in people's belief system. Studies show that procedural fairness increases cooperation only when individuals already trust an authority, implying procedural esteem is recognised through a foundation of prior social conditioning. Again, influencing how important social conditioning is in our belief system. And then there's other aspects of this, power dynamics, neural and social mechanisms. But the takeaway essentially is that there is all manner, an enormous amount of evidence which points to the fact that people will conform to expected social norms. So when the media says this person is a serial killer, most people will just go along with it because of the social norms, because it's coming from authority, because of cognitive biases, because of all the things that I've discussed in this video. So the first big amplifying effect of bias is emotion. The second, which we've already touched upon in some of these examples, is ego. And this leads us to the fourth group that believes that Lucy Letby is guilty or comment that Lucy Letby is guilty, and this is people who simply cannot admit that they're wrong or are never able to concede this under any circumstances. And I've got an article here from Psychology Today that's simply entitled "Why Some People Will Never Admit That They're Wrong." The key points of this article are the typical response to discovering one is wrong to admit it, either fully or partially. Some people refuse to admit they're wrong, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, due to a fragile ego. If one cannot psychologically handle being wrong, they may deny facts to defend their actions or beliefs. So I'm not going to read through the whole thing because all that's fairly self-explanatory, but this is essentially a psychological and ego phenomenon. Then there's another article here, 3 types who can't admit they're wrong and what to do next. So the 2 I'd particularly like to highlight here are the defensive self-protective person and the person who needs control. So again, a lot of this is to do with ego boundaries. And then there's a 3rd article here, why is it so hard to admit our mistakes? And then there are various factors cited, psychological safety being judged, social consequences, role model behaviour, egotism. For me, that's very clearly the most significant in this case, and perhaps shame and social embarrassment. So all of these things are significant in why someone feels psychological difficulty in admitting that they're wrong. But then I think that this is amplified and exacerbated by 2 further factors. The first one is the impact of social media and on people increasingly taking a public position on various issues. So this definitely amplifies everything that I've just mentioned. It means that any social embarrassment by being wrong is made greater, even though these people are often using pseudonyms, but it still feels more public than if they're just saying it to someone at random, even though people can find it very difficult under those circumstances. And then I think not only is this social aspect of saying something publicly, but I think there's a general trend that we see, particularly in politics, but also in the media, of people that just will never, ever, ever concede that they've made a mistake or that they're wrong. I'm sure you can think of some prominent examples in politics. There are prominent examples in the media as well. And it's now almost, I think, seen as a weakness to say that you're wrong about something or we're wrong about something, when in fact, of course, we're all fallible human beings and we're all wrong about things all the time. And actually, an evolved person is aware of the fact that they could be wrong, and they're constantly adjusting their worldview as new facts come along and new information, new evidence, new understanding. That's why I mentioned previously, you would think as all of these experts come out and all this new information comes out, that of course, a lot of people have changed their beliefs, but a certain number of people remain wedded to the idea that Lucy Letby is guilty. It's because they just one of the reasons, I've mentioned some of the others, but one of the reasons is that some of them just simply cannot admit that they're wrong, and they definitely won't do so publicly. And as I say, I do think this is amplified by you get these talking head figures and people in politics as well, who just continually maintain the idea that they are correct. And also, we've now seen that this works. It's not that that's resulted in them being discredited. On one level, they have been discredited, but they've still been able to retain prominent positions. So I think that even more amplifies the idea that to be wrong and to be incorrect about something, to make mistakes, is shameful, and somehow it's something that must be avoided at all costs, even if it requires us to maintain a public position that is utterly ridiculous. So I think that is another major factor. And then, of course, there can be some, in the Venn diagram of why people believe Lucy Letby is guilty, all of these factors can interlink, and that there can be overlap between them, between the cognitive biases, between the emotional biases, between the factor that I've just described in the fourth group. And then finally, the fifth group is simply those that have a vested interest. So this could be most obviously represented by Dr. Dowie Evans and Mr. Paul Hughes, is his title, Detective Inspector Paul Hughes, who simply, I mean, Dowie is really will not admit he's wrong for reasons of ego. It wouldn't harm him at all if he was to come out and say I was wrong. Really, he could say I made mistakes. That would in many ways be the most sensible thing for him to do at this point. But he won't do that because of his own ego and his own arrogance. I don't think Paul Hughes doesn't strike me as an arrogant person. He doesn't strike me as an intelligent person, but he doesn't strike me as an arrogant person. He strikes me as someone who understands now that there are massive consequences for the Cheshire Constabulary, and if they start backpedaling on what they've done, they're clearly never going to do that. And because the police can usually act with impunity, they're just essentially strategically trying to do things to strengthen their position and strengthen their position in the eyes of the general public. In the long run, and hopefully sooner rather than later, this is just not going to work. But they're just desperately clinging to the final threads of what they've done in the vain attempt to pretend that it has credibility. So when I'm doing some of the things that you see in this video, like when I'm walking in the woods or in the countryside and with my dog, I like to just do simple things and just be in beautiful places, and just it's very replenishing for me, particularly when you're dealing with the darkness of this topic. And I often reflect on humanity and the world, and this kind of dichotomy between the beauty of the world and the darkness of human culture and the things that human beings have done. And I often think about or reflect on the fact that the best things in life are still free, and there's nothing better than just, or if not free, very inexpensive, but certainly just walking through beautiful landscape and just sharing things with people that you know and animals is one of the most enjoyable, if not the most enjoyable thing to do. And yet we've created this immensely complex human culture that feeds off darkness and feeds off self-interest and selfishness. And it's also unnecessary, and it doesn't need to be like this. And you look at a situation like this with the sheer stupidity of these institutions protecting themselves because they think that they can only perceive the consequences of being wrong and how serious those consequences are going to be, and how far they've become removed from what is depicted in this video and what I try to do to kind of unravel myself from the darkness of this, which is just walking through the woods, walking through the countryside, in the snow, in the sunshine, with people that are valued to us, with people that we have an emotional bond with. Maybe you'd have a picnic, for example, if you want to do something that costs a very small amount of money. And all of the ego things and all of the material things that we value so highly and that are so pedestalized by our culture often, they really ultimately mean nothing. And another thing that I reflect on when I'm doing this is that Lucy cannot do this. Like, she gets an hour a day out of her cell. The rest of the time she's in a cell, as far as I understand it. I think sometimes they're allowed to do collective things, aren't they? But my understanding, certainly I've seen these like Louis Theroux documentaries, which are very good. You should definitely watch them if you haven't seen them. One is where he's in a big jail in Miami. And they're locked in their cells 23 hours a day and allowed very little outside time at all. And some of the prisoners who've committed the worst offences aren't even allowed to walk around in the yard. They're kept in solitary conditions all the time. Of course, if they've done terrible things, that's a reasonable punishment. But when it's someone who hasn't done it, it's pretty painful. And I do often reflect on the fact that I'm walking by a river, or walking by a stream, or walking through hills, or just in some quiet, peaceful, tranquil place. And I just think Lucy has been shorn of the ability to do this, to feel the sun on her skin, to share moments with friends. She's probably a more sociable person than me, so it's even more painful for her than it would be for me. I think I would cope okay in prison. My problem would be if they introduced me to the prison population, I'd be like, I'm not too keen on this. I'd rather be in solitary confinement. But she clearly was a very sociable person, and so that's going to be very difficult for her as well. And she's being isolated from her parents, isolated from her friends, etc., etc. So when I go through these moments, there are two things that I'm doing. I'm replenishing myself, and I'm trying to reflect on the good in the world, and not just think that the world is all evil, it's all bad, and everything about human culture is wrong. Even though undoubtedly we've done a lot of damage to the planet, as well as though we've done incredible intellectual things that haven't been done by another animal. We've created all manner of destruction, and then we've created, even within our own human culture, we've created massive problems for our own species. Um, and that's undeniable. And I'm not someone who wishes to be an ostrich and bury my head in the sand. I like to acknowledge these things and to truly understand things, but at the same time, I try to reflect on the good in the world, the good in the natural world, and that you can absorb these things and you can still see the beauty of the world and not be mired and immersed in just the darkness. But then I also think about Lucy and that she has a very limited ability to be able to do this, and that she must be in a very dark place. And God, Lord only knows how she feels today. It's a couple of days after these new charges have been levelled at her. She must be in a pretty dark place at this point. Now, I'm going to discuss the specifics related to these charges in a video on Sunday. I could have done that today, but there's a reason why I've delayed it till Sunday. I wanted to make this video today. But another silver lining in the dark clouds that has been a big silver lining for me is that I've met so many people through this who are amazing, who are empathic, who do care, who are intelligent, who are critical thinkers, who do want to fight for Lucy and would fight for other things that are right as well. And that's been amazing for me, and I felt a sense of belonging in that group that I very rarely feel in a group of people, and that's been a wonderful thing, undoubtedly. So I'm sure I've made some people who'll be friends for life, and I've encountered many others who have given me a lot of hope in the human race and in human behaviour and human emotion and the way people are capable of reasoning and overcoming everything that I've discussed in this video. So I hope that one day there can be a happy resolution to this issue, but I should say as well, it certainly won't be anything to celebrate. This is a horrible, dark scenario, and there are no winners in this situation. Whatever happens, infants have died when they didn't need to die, and someone has been locked up when she didn't need to be locked up. No one can ever turn the clock back on those things, and there are a lot of lessons to be learned from this whole debacle. If you live on this planet for long enough, you become sceptical about whether those lessons will be learned, and whether the world that exists within the corridors of power and influence will be able to face up to the reality of these things. But I do think for myself, I'll work in the miscarriage of justice field for the rest of my life, particularly if I can get a bit of a public voice. And that the best way that I can use this voice will be to advocate for reform and maybe to be a voice for other people who suffered from miscarriages of justice. We'll see about that. So that's all I have to say about the issue of why people believe Lucy Letby to be guilty. There are three final points that I want to make on this issue. Firstly, we can't change everyone's mind for all the reasons that I've discussed in this video. Secondly, we don't need everyone to agree with us. We just need a critical mass within the general population. I think we're well on the way to achieving that. And thirdly, the ultimate aim is to win the PR battle, the PR war that is taking place now, so that there's a similar level of public awareness of this issue as occurred with the post office inquiry. That's why I've written a book. I suppose that's why I started doing this YouTube channel. It was completely unplanned, but has had pretty good traction, for which I'm grateful beyond a way that I can express, because I just didn't expect it to happen. But it's been useful for me as someone who may become a bit of a public figure with regard to this, and it's given me a bit of a soft landing before that happens. And it's been very useful. But I'm also enormously grateful for the support I've received, which has been way beyond what I expected. So we've done pretty well with this third aim of winning this PR battle, but we've still got a lot more to do. And this is precisely why these arrests have occurred in the last couple of days. This is essentially the final gambit from the police, because they've got nothing left to throw at us. So we just need to ride this one out, and then there's nothing left. And then the PR war can go entirely in our direction. So thank you for watching. Just to reiterate, in the next video I'm going to be discussing the new allegations made by Cheshire Police against Lucy Letby.